Today on the Perception and Action News, a look at a few recent articles examining the effects of anxiety and pressure on performance, and methods for counteracting these effects. Does pressure affect the planning or online control of movements? Could increasing anxiety in practice benefit motor learning? What are holistic goals, and how can they reduce pressure effects? So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone. This is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In these news segments, my goal is to dig through that ever-growing pile of article PDFs so you don't have to. So on to the news. Dateline Psychological Research, August 2016. First off today, I want to tell you about a study I was involved with in collaboration with John Alsop, who did most of the work, Gav Lawrence, and Mike Kahn. This experiment involved using an aiming task that Gav and Mike have used in several previous studies. In this task, participants are required to move a stylus across a graphics tablet to control the movement of a cursor towards a target on a screen. The movement basically has two requirements. Stop on the target as accurately as possible, and complete the movement to match the target movement time of 400 milliseconds. Participants receive a point score based on both accuracy and movement time that they are shown after each trial. Having a constant movement time allows the data to be pooled from multiple trials so that the spatial variability of the stylus at 4 key points during the movement can be calculated. These are the peak acceleration, the peak velocity, the peak negative acceleration, and the end of the movement. Looking at this variability allows one to separate planning of the movement from online control during the movement. For example, if a movement is perfectly ballistic and pre-planned before it starts, we would expect low variability right at the start of the movement that remains low throughout. Conversely, for a movement that is controlled using information during the movement itself, in other words, online, we would expect relatively high variability at the start of the movement that gets smaller as we get closer to the end. I've included a couple example plots which illustrate these different types of movements in the show notes. In our study, there were 24 participants that were split into a control group and a pressure group. Participants performed a total of 14 training blocks with 30 trials in each over a 2-day period for a total of 420 trials. An interesting element of the design was that the pressure group was asked to perform under pressure at 2 different time points, early in training, in block number 2, and late in training, in block number 14. The control group just kept performing the task without the pressure. The pressure manipulation involved a combination of monetary, a cash prize, and social pressure. They were paired with another person in the study. What was found? In terms of movement accuracy, pressure had no significant effect when it was applied early in training. That is, there was no significant difference between the control and pressure groups. However, when applied late in training, it actually resulted in the pressure group performing better than the control group. A look at some of the other data revealed why. In terms of movement trajectories, the control group used online control throughout the entire training. For the pressure group, there was a significant difference in the trajectory profiles. For non-pressure conditions, they also used online control, but when pressure was applied late in training, they switched to using more pre-planned movements. Questionnaires also revealed that they had increased mental effort under pressure. Therefore, overall, the results are similar to a theory of pressure proposed by Michael Eysenck that I talked about previously in the podcast, processing efficiency theory. That is, the idea that it's possible to counteract the effects of pressure by increasing effort. In terms of the change in trajectory, this seems to be a very effective strategy because it is the online component of movement that we would expect to be susceptible to explicit monitoring under pressure. So switching primarily to pre-planned movements may be an effective means of being clutch when the pressure is on. Dateline, Human Movement Science, June 2016. In the study I just described, pressure and anxiety seem to change the control strategy late in training. In an interesting recent study, Hordacre and colleagues from the University of Adelaide asked whether inducing anxiety before training begins could actually facilitate learning in a motor task. So again, similar to John's study, I think this is unique because of the timing of when the pressure was applied. In the study, 36 participants were split into a control group and a high anxiety group. Before learning the motor task, which I will describe in a second, both groups were asked to perform arithmetic problems, with the difference between the groups being the level of difficulty of these problems. The control group performed simple, single-digit problems like 3 plus 2, while the anxiety group performed ones with 3-digit numbers, like 203 minus 761. Participants had 3 seconds to enter their answer. Previous research has shown that these difficult problems induce anxiety, and the authors confirmed this with questionnaires in the current study. After 15 minutes of doing these arithmetic problems, both groups next moved to the motor task, which was a precision pinch movement. Basically, participants had to squeeze their thumb and index finger together to produce one of 3 target forces, which was indicated by LED lights. Along with a series of training blocks, the study also included a retention test 24 hours later. What was found? During training, there was no significant group difference for either absolute or variable error in the task. Both groups just got better. There is something a little bit odd here if you look at the data, however. In figure 3 in the paper, it seems like the anxiety group had clearly higher errors than the control group in the last 2 blocks of training, but this was never discussed. This is critical when we look at the most important results of the study, those from the retention test. For both variable and absolute errors, there was a significant effective group. That is, as compared to the last block of training, the anxiety group performed better in the 24-hour retention test as compared to the control group. But again, if you look at the figure, this is a bit misleading. For variable error, both groups actually had the exact same performance score on the retention test. The significant group effect only occurred because the anxiety group had a worse score at the end of the training and then got better, while the control group basically stayed the same. Similarly, for absolute error, a large part of the significant difference in retention scores seemed to be due to the fact that the control group was better at the end of training than the anxiety group. Okay, pet peeve of mine here. I've seen several studies that have made a claim like this one. So-and-so training method is better because the training group shows better performance when you go from end of training to retention, or so-and-so pressure reducing technique is better because the experimental group showed less reduction in performance from pre-test to pressure test. But in many cases, like with this Hordacre paper, I think this is very misleading. How can you say a certain training method is better when both groups have the same scores in the end? To me, it's not. Any significant difference produced solely by differences before the retention test starts, or before the pressure is applied, are kind of meaningless in my opinion. All we should really be caring about is how well people perform in the end. A similar effect was also found for reaction time for the task. That is, the anxiety group had consistently lower reaction times in training, but this again went away in the retention test. Finally, there was a significant difference in movement times, with the anxiety group having quicker movements throughout the training and in the retention test. From these findings, the authors concluded that inducing anxiety before training improves motor learning and consolidation. For me, the findings are way too muddy to make this conclusion. Along with the issues I've already discussed, it was also the case that the anxiety group had significantly lower levels of stress and anxiety than the control group at the start of the study, before arithmetic problems were given. So, interesting idea, but way too many group differences to make much of the findings in my opinion.
Just like a main novice, just like a main novice, just like a main novice, for the first time in a long time, but I don't mind it at all.
Dateline, Psychology of Sport and Exercise, August 2016. The final study I want to discuss is one conducted by Richard Mullen, Lou Hardy, and colleagues from Bangor University. When faced with having to perform in a high-anxiety situation, what should the goal of the performer be? How can an athlete focus on performing their skill correctly without at the same time inducing explicit monitoring and over-controlling their action? As first proposed by Hardy and Nelson in 1988, One way this could be achieved is by focusing on holistic process goals as opposed to part process goals. Let's look at the difference between these two. Part process goals focus on the specific skills and strategies that are essential for successful task execution. For example, a golfer might be given the goal of keeping a relaxed grip on the club when making a high-pressure putt. But, of course, such part process goals are encouraging an internal focus on an aspect of the skill using explicit knowledge, which we know can disrupt skilled performance and lead to choking. A better alternative may be to use a holistic process goals, which are goals that focus on a single conceptual or abstract cue that captures the skill in its entirety rather than on a specific aspect of it. So, for example, a skilled golfer might use the word smooth or the word tempo as a holistic cue to trigger the automatic movements involved in the putting skill. In many ways, these holistic goals are similar to learning by analogy, which I discussed back in episode 16. Both analogies and holistic goals encourage chunking of a movement into an encapsulated representation, which is harder to break into and disrupt. Given that holistic goals should encourage more automatic processing, while part process goals should encourage effortful, controlled processing, Hardy and colleagues have predicted the use of holistic goals should result in better performance under pressure. To date, research examining this prediction has been somewhat mixed. In this recent study, Mullen and colleagues sought to expand on this previous work. Specifically, 30 participants were asked to perform a simulated driving task. After an acquisition period, they were split into a group of 15 that were given a part process goal and a group of 15 that were given a holistic process goal. Participants self-selected their goals from a master list. The 3 holistic process goals all focused on the steering movement. They could choose between goals of smooth, glide, or easy. In contrast, the part process goals focused on the explicit knowledge required to steer. The first part process goal was 9-15 grip, which referred to maintaining the hands at 9 and 3 o'clock positions on the wheel throughout the turn. The second goal was outside hand, which focused on using the outside hand to turn the steering wheel. The final part process goal was small, which referred to making small adjustments to the steering wheel rather than using bang-bang control. Pressure was induced in a competitive phase by telling participants they were part of a team and that there would be a cash prize for the team with the fastest combined lap time. Along with performance measures and questionnaires, this study also used 2 common physiological measures of stress: heart rate variability, which I talked about back in episode 8A, and salivary alpha amylase, or SAA. What was found? As predicted, the holistic process goal group performed better in competition. On average, their lap time was just over 1 second faster. They had lower steering errors, as measured by the root mean squared error from the center of the lane, and their errors were significantly less severe when they did make them. There was no significant group difference in any of the physiological methods. For both the holistic and part process groups, heart rate variability decreased, SAA increased, and mental effort increased. It was also the case that the part process group did not actually choke under pressure. They actually just maintained their performance while the holistic group got better. These 2 latter findings make the picture of what is going on a little less clear than the predictions I described at the beginning. Yes, holistic goals do seem to result in better performance under pressure, but it's not clear whether or not this is because they're preventing explicit monitoring. Anyways, I think the idea of using holistic process goals is a really intriguing one. Telling an athlete not to focus on their performance when they're in a critical situation seems very counterintuitive to many and is very difficult to achieve. So finding a way to allow a performer to focus on their action without inducing explicit monitoring is something that should be explored more in the future. Well, that's it for the news. Coming soon on the Perception and Action podcast, what is motion and depth blindness? And how might it be related to an athlete's preferred position in team sports? If you're interested in more articles like this, give me a follow on Twitter @ShakyWeights. And remember, you can find everything you ever wanted to know about this podcast at perceptionaction.com. This is your intrepid reporter, Rob Gray from ASU. I am out of here.